10,000 crabs dumped into a river that hasn't seen life in decades. The scientists expected maybe a few would survive. What they got instead was an ecological resurrection that rewrote everything we thought we knew about ecosystem recovery. And it all started with one species nobody thought could make a difference. Stick around, because this gets absolutely wild. The Tagus River in Portugal used to be one of Europe's most vibrant ecosystems. Keyword, used to be. By the 1980s, it was basically an open sewer. Industrial waste, agricultural runoff, untreated sewage from Lisbon, all of it pouring into the river 24/7. The water was so polluted that nothing could live in it. No fish, no plants, not even the bacteria that normally break down organic matter. It was biologically dead. A 1,000 kilometer chemical soup flowing through the heart of Portugal. The smell alone was enough to make people avoid the riverbanks. Locals stopped fishing decades earlier. There was nothing to catch anyway. The water had this weird oily sheen to it. Industrial chemicals creating rainbow patterns on the surface. Kids were told never to go near it. Touch that water and you were getting dragged to the hospital for a tetanus shot at minimum. Portugal knew they had a problem. This wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was an embarrassment. The capital city's main river looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. So in the 1990s, they started cleanup efforts. New sewage treatment plants. Regulations on industrial dumping. Fines for companies that violated pollution standards. It took years and hundreds of millions of euros. But slowly, the chemistry of the water started to improve. The water quality had reached acceptable levels. You could measure the pollutants, and they were below dangerous thresholds. Great. Problem solved. Right? Not even close. Because here's the thing about dead ecosystems. They don't just bounce back because the poison stops flowing. The river was clean, but it was empty. Nothing lived there. No fish had returned. No crabs, no mollusks, no aquatic plants. The riverbed was a sterile wasteland of silt and rocks. This is where it gets interesting. Scientists looking at the Tagus realized they were dealing with something called an ecological trap. The environment was technically habitable now, but there was nothing living there to jumpstart the ecosystem. It's like having a perfectly good house with no furniture, no electricity, and no plumbing. Sure, you could theoretically live there, but why would you? In a healthy river ecosystem, everything is connected. Plants produce oxygen and provide food. Small invertebrates eat the plants and algae. Fish eat the invertebrates. Bigger fish eat the smaller fish. Birds eat the fish. Everything's eating, pooping, dying, and decomposing. That cycle creates nutrients, which feed more plants, which support more invertebrates, and the whole thing keeps spinning. But when you kill everything, that cycle stops. Even if the water becomes clean again, there's no cycle to restart. You need something, anything, to break the deadlock. This is where the crabs come in. Specifically the Chinese mitten crab, which sounds like the setup to a joke but is actually a crucial part of this story. Now, before anyone gets excited, these weren't Chinese mitten crabs. Those are an invasive nightmare. What Portugal actually used were native European green crabs. Carcinus manus if you want to get technical about it. These crabs used to be everywhere in the Tagus, before the pollution killed them all. They're tough, adaptable, and most importantly, they're what ecologists call an ecosystem engineer. An ecosystem engineer is a species that physically modifies its environment in ways that create opportunities for other species. Beavers are the classic example. They build dams, which create ponds, which create wetland habitats, which support hundreds of other species. Green crabs do something similar, just underwater and less photogenic. These crabs are scavengers and predators. They eat pretty much anything. Dead stuff, algae, small invertebrates, whatever they can get their claws on. And here's the key part. They're active. They move around constantly, digging through sediment, looking for food. They expose buried nutrients. They aerate the sediment. They create little disturbances that other organisms can colonize. The scientists had a hypothesis. If they introduced a large enough population of green crabs into the cleaned-up sections of the Tagus, maybe those crabs could jumpstart the ecosystem. It was a gamble. Release 10,000 crabs into a dead river and hope they survive long enough to make a difference. No pressure. The crabs came from healthy estuaries along the Portuguese coast. Scientists collected them over several months, kept them in holding facilities, checked them for diseases and parasites. They couldn't risk introducing sick crabs that would die immediately or spread problems. Each crab got inspected, measured, and tagged. That would be insane. But they tagged enough to track survival rates and movement patterns. In March 2012, the release happened. 10,000 green crabs dumped into a 15-kilometer stretch of the Tagus estuary that had been dead for 30 years. The scientists expected maybe 20% survival in the first year. Crabs are tough, but introducing any species into a barren environment is risky. No established food sources, no shelter, no existing crab population to integrate with. These pioneers were on their own. The first few weeks were tense. The team went out every day, sampling the water, looking for dead crabs, checking their monitoring stations. Some crabs died immediately. That was expected. You can't move 10,000 animals without some casualties from stress alone. But more survived than died. By week 4, they were finding evidence of crabs everywhere in that 15-kilometer stretch. Molted shells, which meant the crabs were growing, which meant they were settling in. Then something unexpected happened. The crabs started reproducing. Fast, way faster than anyone predicted. By June, just 3 months after release, they were finding juvenile crabs. Lots of them. The population wasn't just surviving, it was exploding. Within a year, the scientists estimated there were over 50,000 crabs in that stretch of river, 5 times the number they released. But population growth wasn't the shocking part. It was what came after. See, those crabs were doing exactly what the scientists hoped. They were tearing up the riverbed, eating everything they could find. And in the process, they were creating chaos. Good chaos. Ecological chaos. When crabs dig through sediment looking for food, they expose nutrients that have been locked away. Nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter. Stuff that's been sitting buried and useless. By bringing it to the surface, they make it available to other organisms. And the first organisms to take advantage were algae and bacteria. Within 6 months of the crab release, the scientists started seeing algae growth. Not the toxic blue-green algae blooms you see in polluted water. Healthy green algae and diatoms. Single-celled organisms that form the absolute foundation of aquatic food webs. These things appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Well, not nowhere. They'd been there all along, dormant or in tiny numbers, waiting for conditions to improve. The crabs created those conditions. The algae attracted zooplankton, microscopic animals that eat algae. The zooplankton attracted small fish. By year 2, fish were returning to the Tagus. Not many at first, just small species like gobies and blennies. But they were there, living, reproducing fish in a river that hadn't seen fish in 30 years. Year 3 was when things got really interesting. Larger fish started showing up. Mullet, sea bass, even some flounder. These are species that need established food webs to survive. They don't show up in dead environments. Their presence meant the ecosystem was not just recovering. It was actually functioning. There was enough food, enough oxygen, enough of everything to support higher-level predators. Birds noticed. Herons started showing up to hunt the fish. Gulls came for the crabs. Cormorants dove for the mullet. Suddenly, sections of the Tagus that had been lifeless were full of activity. You could stand on the bank and watch herons stalking through shallow water, something nobody had seen in decades. The plant situation was equally dramatic. Aquatic plants started returning, seagrasses, which need clean water and stable sediment to grow. The crabs had helped create those conditions. The plants, once established, did what plants do. They produced oxygen, provided shelter for small fish and invertebrates, stabilized the sediment even more. Positive feedback loops everywhere. The scientists were documenting species in the Tagus that hadn't been seen there in 50 years. Shellfish beds reappeared. Mussels, cockles, clams. These are filter feeders that clean the water by eating suspended particles. More shellfish meant cleaner water, which meant more plants, which meant more fish. The ecosystem was building itself. Here's where it gets really wild. The recovery wasn't staying contained to that initial 15-kilometer stretch. It was spreading. The crabs were migrating up and down the river. As they moved, they took the ecosystem recovery with them. Sections of the river 30 or 40 kilometers away from the original release site started showing the same patterns. Algae growth, zooplankton blooms, fish returning. Nobody expected this scale of impact. The original hypothesis was that maybe, if they were lucky, they'd get some localized improvement in biodiversity. A few more species in that one stretch of river. What they got instead was a cascading ecological resurrection that spread across hundreds of square kilometers of dead river. The Portuguese scientists published their findings in 2017, and the ecology world lost its collective mind. This wasn't supposed to work this well. Ecosystem restoration projects usually take decades and require constant intervention. Replanting native species, removing invasives, continuous monitoring and adjustment. The Tagus crabs did it themselves in 5 years with minimal human involvement beyond the initial release. Other countries took notice. Spain started looking at doing similar projects in polluted rivers. France began studying whether the approach could work in the sea. Even countries outside Europe were interested. Could you use ecosystem engineers to kickstart recovery in other dead or dying waterways? But let's talk about what made this work. Because it's not as simple as dumping crabs in any dead river and expecting miracles. Several factors had to align perfectly. First, the water quality had to actually be fixed. The crabs would have died just like everything else if the river was still toxic. You can't engineer an ecosystem in poison. Portugal spent 20 years and massive amounts of money cleaning up the pollution first. That was the foundation for everything else. Second, they chose the right species. Green crabs are native to the region, so they're adapted to local conditions. They're generalists, meaning they can eat a wide variety of food sources. They're tough and can tolerate variable conditions. And crucially, they're ecosystem engineers that create benefits for other species. Not every animal does that. Some species are what ecologists call passengers. They benefit from the ecosystem, but don't really modify it. Green crabs are drivers. Third, they released enough individuals. 10,000 crabs sounds like a lot, and it is. But it was calculated. Too few, and the population might not reach critical mass to reproduce successfully. Too many, and they might exhaust food resources and crash. The scientists modeled this extensively before the release, and 10,000 turned out to be just right. Fourth, timing mattered. They released the crabs in early spring, right before the reproductive season. This gave the crabs time to acclimate and then immediately breed. If they'd released in fall, the crabs would have faced winter without established populations. Many would have died before reproducing. Spring release meant maximum reproductive output in year 1. Fifth, and this is subtle, the Tagus had the right physical structure. The river wasn't just polluted, it was the right kind of river for crabs. Estuarine environment, brackish water, muddy substrate. Crabs love that. If the river had been rocky or fast-flowing, the crabs would have struggled to establish territories and burrows. Geography matters. So yes, the crab release worked brilliantly. But it worked because of careful planning, significant prior investment in cleanup, and favorable conditions. This isn't a magic bullet solution you can just drop anywhere. But what it does show is that ecosystem recovery can happen much faster than we thought, if you understand the ecology and make strategic interventions. Commercial fishing returned to parts of the Tagus for the first time in 40 years. Not huge operations, but small-scale fishermen started catching mullet and bass in areas that had been dead zones. Shellfish harvesting resumed in some sections. Tourism picked up. People wanted to see the recovered river. Birdwatchers showed up for the herons and cormorants. The river went from being an embarrassment to being a success story. Property values near the river increased. When the Tagus was a toxic sewer, nobody wanted to live near it. As it recovered, suddenly riverfront property became desirable again. This created economic incentive for continued cleanup and protection. When people have financial stakes in a healthy river, they're more motivated to keep it healthy. The crab population exploded so dramatically that in some areas they became a minor nuisance. Too many crabs eating too many shellfish. But this self-corrected as predators moved in. More fish meant more crab predators. More birds meant more crab predators. The ecosystem balanced itself out within a few years. Scientists are still monitoring the Tagus today, more than a decade after the initial release. The recovery is holding. In fact, it's still improving. New species keep showing up. The biodiversity is approaching what historical records suggest the river had before industrialization. It's not perfect. Some pollution-sensitive species still haven't returned, but it's a functioning ecosystem, which is something nobody thought they'd see again. Other projects inspired by the Tagus crabs have had mixed results. A similar attempt in the Seine in France worked, but more slowly. The river was larger and the pollution history was different. A project in Spain failed initially because they didn't address ongoing pollution sources first. You can't add crabs to a river that's still being poisoned and expect them to fix it. The lesson is that each situation is unique and requires careful assessment. The broader scientific impact of the Tagus study has been huge. It provided proof of concept that strategic species introduction can accelerate ecosystem recovery dramatically. Before this, the conventional wisdom was that ecosystems recover slowly and naturally, or not at all. The Tagus showed that with the right intervention at the right time, you can speed up recovery by decades. This has implications for restoration projects worldwide. Coral reef restoration, forest regrowth after deforestation, grassland recovery after overgrazing. All of these could potentially benefit from similar approaches. The species that create conditions for others to thrive, and focus restoration efforts there. There's also been social science research around the Tagus recovery. Communities that had written off the river as hopeless started engaging with it again. Environmental groups formed to protect the recovering ecosystem. Schools started using the river for educational programs. When people see that recovery is possible, they invest emotionally in conservation. Hopelessness breeds apathy. Success breeds engagement. The Tagus crabs have become something of a symbol in Portugal. There's a sculpture in Lisbon commemorating the project. Children's books about the crabs bringing the river back to life. It entered the cultural consciousness as a story of redemption and environmental recovery. That's powerful. Environmental messaging is often doom and gloom. The Tagus is a success story, and people respond to that. Looking forward, the lessons from the Tagus are being applied to increasingly ambitious projects. There's discussion of using similar approaches in the heavily polluted rivers of Eastern Europe. China has expressed interest, given their massive water pollution problems. The techniques are being adapted for different contexts, different species, different challenges. The key takeaway from the Tagus experiment is this: ecosystems are more resilient than we often give them credit for. They want to recover. They're primed to recover. But sometimes they need a push. Sometimes they need that one keystone species, that ecosystem engineer that can break the deadlock and set the recovery cascade in motion. In the Tagus, green crabs were that species. It might be something else entirely. The trick is figuring out what that species is and creating the conditions for it to succeed. 10,000 crabs didn't just survive in a dead river. They resurrected it. They triggered a transformation that brought back fish, birds, plants, and hope to a waterway that everyone had given up on. That's not just good science. That's a reminder that even the most damaged ecosystems can recover if we give them the right help at the right time. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories about unexpected environmental recoveries and the science behind them, hit subscribe. More videos coming soon.